Okay, so boa noite. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the series Brazil 200 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. Topic this week is Spirits at the Crossroads, Navigation with Evangelicalism, the case of the Brazilian Candomblé. And then it's presented by Dr. Yanique Hume. She's senior lecturer in cultural studies at the University of the West Indies Case Hill campus, and hosted by me. You know me already. My name is Marco Schaumloeffel. I teach Portuguese and German at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. So this presentation is part of a free series of workshops, presentations, and discussions presented by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. So welcome back, everyone. And good night, Yanique. My friend Yanique, I can say so, my colleague for many years.
Yes.
It's a pleasure having you here. And I'm very excited personally also to hear your talk tonight about this topic. So first of all, let me first briefly introduce Yanique to you so you know a bit more about her. So Yanique, or I should call her Dr. Hume, is a multifaceted scholar, a dancer, a choreographer with extensive research, expertise, and specialization across the Americas and the African diaspora. As a tenured academic from the Caribbean with extensive regional and international experience, she has secured expertise and contribution to the Caribbean intellectual tradition, operating from the disciplines of cultural anthropology and performance studies. Dr. Hume's research experience and teaching areas include religious and performance cultures of the African diaspora. And here is where we will talk. That's our topic today, right? Caribbean thought, popular culture, migration, and diasporic identities. As a multilingual researcher, her fieldwork experience in dance, forms, and sacred arts are centered in the Caribbean and in Latin America, especially in Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, and Colombia. In applied research, her work has focused on the creative industries and cultural policy, migration and tourism, museological production and management. She is the co-editor of Caribbean Cultural Thought from Plantation to Diaspora, published in 2013, Caribbean Popular Culture, Power, Politics, and Performance, 2016, and Passages and Afterworlds, Anthropological Perspectives on Death in the Caribbean, 2018. Dr. Hume is the recipient of grants from the Social Science Research Council, the International Development Research Center, Ford Foundation, and the Wenner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research. As a professional dancer and choreographer, she has worked with the National Dance Theatre Company of Jamaica, La Cadgo, United Caribbean Dance Force, and Danza Caribe of Cuba. Her choreography draws on over 24 years of training in Afro-Caribbean dance, specializations in Haiti, Jamaica, and Cuban movement vocabularies. Dr. Hume brings additional competences in dance and theater production management, grant writing, budget analysis, project program evaluation, contingency planning, directing international cultural exchange projects across different linguistic territories within the Caribbean and Latin America. And she is proficient in 5 languages: English, Spanish, Portuguese, Creole, Jamaican, Patois. So wow. So we usually talk in Portuguese and English as well. Yeah, impressive, Dr. Hume. So welcome. Let me now share. So you will talk about Afro-Brazilian religions, more specifically Candomblé tonight, right? And the implications of the neo-Pentecostal evangelicals that are they're expanding and getting more and more followers in Brazil by the day, by the hour as we speak, right? So welcome, Yanique. I will now share your presentation, and feel free to
before you share
your initial work.
Yeah, before you share that work, because I recognize, welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining, and good evening. Thank you for your introduction, Marco. What the presentation I have is more introductory and kind of cursory in terms of introducing Candomblé for those who are unfamiliar with it. But what I wanted to really delve into in terms of our conversation this evening is, in fact, the implications of the spread of a new form of imperial Christianity through the guise of the evangelical movement, and what that is doing to many African diaspora traditions. I will focus on Candomblé, but in speaking about the focus of this gathering is to understand that Brazil is not an anomaly in the case of how the spread of these hyper right-wing movements are impacting traditional ways of knowing, of being, and of existing, and not only just the implication it has for practitioners, but the destabilization that follows when the heroes are under attack, when these micro universes, if you will, get destabilized by the onslaught of the politics that ensues behind it, right? So when we think about Candomblé, and we think through the ways in which religion, African diaspora religions more generally, we could call them Africana religions, Black Atlantic religions. When we think about Candomblé, it's recognizing and understanding the very ways in which this tradition is held almost as a beacon of the ways in which Africans reformulated their lives, translated their lives from the continent to the New World. And we recognize in the work, for example, of many scholars who've been working in this field, from Sheila Walker to Maturi, Laurent, Professor Maturi, and the ways in which they speak about the cross currents and interaction between these spaces of religious history, of knowledge, of ideas, and a sharing that really upsets the ways in which we had prior to the work of these scholars conceived of how African diaspora religions survived and reinvented themselves in the New World. There was a way in which we saw the Atlantic Ocean as a site of severing. And we've seen this beautiful documentary, Atlántico Negro, is it called? The Roots of the Orisha, mm-hmm. And the ways in which in that film, in that documentary, and in the work that we see coming out of contemporary research, that this ocean that was embodied to be a site of rupture, the space in which the memories of what we held in our bodies, in our minds, in our practices fell to the wayside. We saw how, in fact, the ocean was seen as a ways in which that connectivity was able to sustain itself. And the ways that through the Bight of Benin, there was interaction between Brazil and Benin, Nigeria, even Ghana, and these spaces and the movement that we see between the circulatory movement that we see between the continent and Brazil, dating back to the periods of enslavement, right? And a very active movement between, and what that afforded was a sedimenting of the religious world views, cosmovision of large segments of the Brazilian population. So I'll go to the slides now. I just wanted to provide that as an opening and then share some slides, and then we'll open for a conversation.
No, I also said, just to complement the last part I heard, so it's also what Pierre Verger, for example, called the flux and the reflux between Africa and Brazil and Africa and the whole Atlantic world, yeah. Right? So I'm sharing now already. So let me know. I guess you are seeing the presentation now, right?
Yes, you could go to the slide. So this is text heavy to a certain degree, but then we'll get in. Let's start with Joseph Murphy. who begins to think through this concept of candomblé and its various meanings of how we begin to explore it as a space, a dance, a community. And what's interesting is that it's not just specific to candomblé. Sorry for the background noise. It's not just specific to candomblé, but that when we look at traditions in other parts of the Caribbean, for example, in Jamaica with Kumina, which is a Congo-based practice, Kumina is also recognized as a space, a dance, a community. So we see that in the African diaspora world, oftentimes these blanket terminologies that we often distill into just a singular thing actually operates across a multifarious or a multifaceted layers, right, of meaning for those who are part of these communities. And moving on, and as part of and so they're layered in these ways that we begin to understand what are these traditions formed in Bahia, as we see here during the 19th century, and like other traditions similar to candomblé, the enslaved labor that was brought to the New World is what is means through which the passage of this information was brought to the Americas, and the Northern Black Atlantic in particular. And then Salvador became this site, not to say that it doesn't exist in other parts of Brazil, but certainly Salvador de Bahia becomes the Mecca, if you will, for this religious institution to sediment itself within the cultural landscape, the social landscape, and the religious tapestry of Brazil, and the Northeast in particular. So we start with a very important distinction, and I would say in terms of how we begin to trace spiritual lineages within candomblé, which stands out as a really important aspect. And when we think about what the implications of the attacks of the right-wing Protestant movements, evangelical movements, and their implications to family, to the very concept of family, to the very concept of the gendered and racial dimensions to this, cannot be something that we bracket out. Because in fact, candomblé, as it was brought to Brazil, was very much seated in a matricentric core, right? And we see some of the early leaders of this matricentric core of religious leadership. Moving forward. So we have Francisco da Silva Llanosa Oca as being one of the elders of one of the tejeros, one of the, what we would call the ancestral, one of the ancestral tejeros of Bahia. And we see within her a sense of lineage that emerges from that particular line. She's a priestess of Shango, of Cabiosile, as he's also known. And there was a legacy that was constructed through her development or translation of this ritual knowledge, spiritual knowledge to Brazil, in that there was a way in which this sense of the purity of practice, right? The authenticity of practice. And of course, these are concepts that when we think about as religions move, as spiritual practices move, we recognize that these aren't monoliths. They do not stay static. They are subject to shifts, to evolutions, to innovations. But some of these ancestral tejeros, which will be laid out shortly, hold on to that very sense of a rootedness in an African origin. And the process through which these traditions and the knowledge is passed on is really important, the transmission aspect, where these are initiatory systems. Candomblé, like the Cuban Lukumi system, like Vodun in Haiti, are systems that follow along a trajectory that we would call initiatory families, where broader sacred and spiritual kinships are forged through the practice of initiation. And as we know, to initiate is in fact to begin. So while one's spiritual quest may have started well before the actual act of initiation. Initiation is what opens the portal through which this kind of relationship that one forges with others is able to be initiated. So we have this Iyanosa sending her daughter to study in Benin, I believe, or Nigeria, to receive the ritual knowledge from the source itself, right? And then her successor would have been gone through that practice as well, and then they go through a period of 7 years of religious apprenticeship. So we see within the structure, and you can just go through the slides because I'll talk through them. We see through the structure of the creation of this sense of lineage building and transmission through an apprenticeship process that some may see as quite lengthy or short, depends on what vantage point you're looking in. But this sense of training being an essential part, and this becomes very important because there's a way in which African diaspora religions are often conceived of as being as lacking logic, as lacking in order, as somehow they get cast as these practices that are quote unquote demonic or atavistic or uncivilized, without really understanding just how intricate they are as complex systems in and of themselves. Here's an image of the Terreiro of Casabranco de Engenho Velho, and one of the oldest of the terreiros we find in Salvador de Bahia. And we also have this sense of, and here's the two leaders of another temple space, Ilegantois, we have here, and you see the depth of time and the lineage, how far back these terreiros are formed, the leaders, many of whom would have been enslaved Black women, who these spaces were spaces of refuge for not only themselves, and we have the beautiful work by Rachel Harding in her discussion of Candomblé being a refuge in thunder, this idea of these sanctuary, these spaces of which one could seek a sense of solace, as well as a space to recharge, to renew, and to provide a space for the community to feel they are a part. So we could just go forward, and these could maybe be part of another document that lives somewhere, but these are just to give an eye, because oftentimes when we think about African diaspora traditions, we don't always put images to the leaders, to the very people we're talking about, that these are actually traditions that are formed through human labor in conjunction with that of the spirit and in conjunction with that of the community, serving together for a higher purpose. Yeah? We could go forward. So we have Eliasheo Ofunja with Mai Ania, that's one of the earliest founders. So an image of Casablanca again. And so we have in these spaces these idea of creating these rural, recreating the atmosphere of which these traditions would have existed within the context of their adopted homes, right? And being able to be a space to center and anchor the ways of conduct, to teach about the different orishas, which are forces of nature, elemental, these are deities that come from the Yoruba cosmology, the Yoruba cosmovision of the universe that understands the oneness of source, the oneness of God, who represents as Olodumare, but then with the sense of the important realm of the ancestral realm and the important realm of the orishas, or the divinities, the various deities who manifest in the natural elements of the universe, whether in the sea for Yemoja, Oshun for the ocean, or for the sweet waters or rivers, Shango and thunder, representing retributive justice. We have Ochosi, the forest, Ogun, war, the kind of warrior spirit, Eshu, the opener of the ways. So all of these divinities stand to represent different components, each with their vices and virtues, but all with the sense of standing in a position to assist the living human beings. Part of the matrix, when we think about the Yoruba cosmology and what it means, it represents this idea of the harmony and balance between all aspects of life. So human beings are in harmony with the gods, are in harmony with the natural environment. And it's to live in a state of equilibrium, which is the greatest, is what you aspire to live in a state of equilibrium. And these traditions were very much grounded in an aspect of life that is centered around health, healing, well-being, right? That's their central focus, is to secure the well-being of the individuals, to assist individuals find and activate a pathway that will allow them to live their divine purpose, what it is, their destiny, what it is they've come to do, come in greater communion with the divine universe through different activities, whether it be a toque de santo, toque, or a bembe, where there's a drum feast, where the drummers call upon the divinities so that they could manifest in the bodies of the adherents to be able to transmit messages, divine messages, to those who are assembled. So there are aspects, what is very curious when we think about the ways, the performative ways in which evangelical Christians serve God. It's very much an embodied practice. I'm not sure how many are familiar. And you could stop sharing now because I don't have any images of the evangelical practices, but it's interesting when we think about how the body is central to the service of evangelical practices. There, while the actual space may be stripped of what may be called idolatrous images, right? So there isn't this tradition of having objects or images of which to contemplate. So the actual space of where people gather, and in many places in Brazil, I mean, the first few occasions of traveling to Brazil and seeing these enormous stadium-like temples or churches that are packed, ram-packed, right? But they are oftentimes stripped of any kind of image that would suggest anything other than the supremacy of the Lord, right? And so, in comparison to a tradition like Candomblé, that is very much about the image, about making what is visceral, making what is invisible viscerally present, right? Viscerally present, either through evoking the manifestation to occur through the body, or through the adornments of which one designs, and whether it's the abebe or the fan, the bronze fan that is used by Oshun and the other ayabas or queens within the Yoruba pantheon, whether it's the staff that is used by Oshala. So there's an entire industry, aesthetic industry, artistic industry that has developed around Candomblé in service of of dressing the orishas, the space of which these events are taking place, as well as the adornments of which accompanies the orishas on their altars in their homes and so forth. And so you have this aesthetic element, which within the evangelical tradition is not present. However, the performative element is. And what is particularly curious is that when there is this idea of being overcome by the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, or however it may be termed, there is this sense where the body is opened for that manifestation. You might have people speaking in tongues. You might have the laying of hands, the falling out. So there are aspects that we see have a certain continuity in terms of being able to trace where are and what are those aspects that we see can be shared, right? And what is really, and I start from that vantage point because within an understanding African systems of thought, African faith systems, indigenous traditional systems, I speak of specifically, there is a sense that sacred power is expansive. So when Africans were enslaved and brought to the Americas, they brought this deep-seated philosophy around faith and around religiosity, around spirituality, which was much more about adapting, accommodating, embracing, and it was more in the sense of the expansionist ways in which you could begin to see how religion operates. It was for how can this better make sense of the lives that we were living. So it wasn't that there was an onslaught of a complete rejection of the Christianity they faced. In fact, there was an incorporation and in a reinterpretation and an expansion of this. But what we find on the other end of the spectrum is that the fundamentalist forms of Christianity and the forms that it's taken now has a more, I would hasten to say, a restrictive. So there is now this sense that the oneness of God only looks a particular way at a particular time, at a particular space, and through a particular lens and through a particular way of practice. So whereas you had a more expansionist understanding of faith in one moment, we're finding a much more restrictive and constricted ways of which spirit, the energy and that energetic force is understood and imbued and imbibed. And so the worrying part of that, because when you do have this sense of restriction, what that then doesn't allow for is space for alternatives, space for others, space for the very notion of multiplicity, space for understanding that we occupy a universe that is peopled by many different traditions, many different faiths, and many of which hold the same precepts of there being a oneness in this concept of God, right? So even though, you know, the God that one may pray to in one context may be Allah, maybe Yahweh, maybe Jah, maybe Buddha, maybe Vishnu, Krishna, maybe Lakshmi, maybe all of these variants, there is this sense, and we often mistake this notion of a polytheism that trumps a monotheism. Even when there are multiple divinities, there is still a concept within many African systems of thought that there is a oneness of God. And these manifestations of other entities is a manifestation of the oneness of that one source. And so the challenge, therefore, is how do we, well, one of the questions one might raise is how did we get here? And there are many reasons of how we got to this stage of this hyper kind of, it's not quite xenophobic, but there's a phobia there, which I haven't quite figured out what it may be called, but there is definitely a fear of, a fear of something that is beyond, that is seen to be a threat to the narrative or the rhetoric of there only being, this being the only salvation. But when people are pressed when people are feeling a sense of dismay and being lost, one of the ways that those who are fallen, those who are on their knees they're vulnerable, right? They're open to then receive things that are placed in the guise of aid, but in fact may serve to actually undermine the very structures of the communities of which they're coming from. And I look to Candomblé as I do to Haiti and to Vodun in particular, and the ways in which the evangelical missionaries took root in that country soon after the earthquake of 2010. And the intensity of their presence on the ground, and what that has done and continues to do in terms of displacing the primacy of the umfos, peristyles as being important sites for community building and upliftment. And when we think about this notion of Candomblé being not just a religion, but a space and a community, when we think through the attacks that have been launched, we get a sense to put it in perspective as to what is at stake here. Because it's not just the leaders, and it's not just this kind of vague sense of, oh, it's just this religion that doesn't make any sense, or that it's black magic, or it's and all of the various negative connotations that are assigned to it. But that these are their structures that shape the very cultural ethos of a people, one would say of a region even, because these are not just traditions of a book. They are transmitted orally, they are transmitted through an embodied praxis that has honed over generations. In showing the first set of images of women, we get the sense of its matricentric focus, even though we are well aware that there are many Pai de Santos that exist, or fathers of the Babalorishas, or fathers of the mysteries, but that the destabilization of the core of these tejeros impacts the very structures of communities, because in many spaces, the same way that a temple space, a church, let's say, a mosque, a synagogue, is a space of refuge for those wanting the sanctity of that sense of coverage, right? And they may go into these spaces to heal, to restore, to root themselves. The same way that the tejeros function in that way, but even beyond that way, because the tejeros became or have been the spaces of the first pharmacies, right? The knowledge of herbal lore, the knowledge of folk medicines, the knowledge of plants and their healing properties, their medicinal properties that are activated in the healing practices that are associated with these traditions, that gets undermined when tejeros are under attack. So too does the sense of historical heritage, lineage, and this idea of what has it meant for these traditions, which this is just a latest iteration. Many of these traditions have gone through anti-superstitious campaigns throughout their entire histories. They've gone through periods of being under attack. But the question is, what makes this moment of the contemporary distinct from the moments of before is the adamant and vicious politicization of the movement, that it's not separate apart, and it's playing on and it's preying on the fears of the disenfranchised with this whole slew of prosperity gospels that come to on this side and you will become rich, you will find your heaven on earth, you will find these things if only you give of this and you get rid of that. And I was like, well, if it's going to provide all of that, why can it not be accommodative? to recognize that many of these communities also have a worldview that includes other elements. Where do we situate the ancestors in this? The same ancestors that have been pivotal in providing a sense of balance and grounding for those who've been part of these traditions for centuries, right? And so we have to begin to ask those questions and see, is there and where can we find a space of accommodation where the two could coexist, right? Because we've had a long history of Catholicism and Africana religions existing side by side. The whole very notion of syncretism, and however we whether we support it as a concept or not, but this very notion of the blending and mixing of religious traditions and the creation of new worlds, new visions, new divinities even, is this idea of the two of different traditions being able to coexist and live side by side with one another. And in this
Yanique, can I just interrupt you?
Yeah.
Just a little bit. I know I'm cutting your line of thought, but I was thinking all what you were saying here all the time about this. It's so amazing that although Afro-Brazilian religion suffered so much, especially in the hands of Catholic religion, making a shoe a devil and all that. But it's very ironic that today we can say that this was better than what we have right now in a totalitarian, completely a system that does not tolerate anything else.
Yeah.
So it was in a certain way, is sad to say, but it was in a certain way better before. When they were at least allowed to coexist, even if they were reprimanded and discriminated and all that, right?
Yeah.
And this does not allow any space for that now.
Yes, exactly the point. And I really, in the next 15 minutes, want to just open it up to a dialogue, because it really does speak of a sense of regression, right? So it's an interesting thing, because we're speaking of part of the narrative that the fundamentalist right holds is this idea of modernity, progress, capitalism, all of these things in terms of we are marching towards a greater sense of security by marching away from what may be seen as atavistic. But as we are marching towards that, this notion of progress and modernity and order, the very structures that also have an adaptive quality to them are seen as not only just being threatening, but deny the very space, the active space that they've played throughout history, right? And when you mention in terms of how, it's quite ironic that now we could look back and think, oh man, during the whole the moments of the conflicts with Catholicism. But what's interesting is that because within, and I believe it was Pierre Verger, was it? No, Pierre. No, it wasn't. It wasn't Pierre Verger. He he was a scholar of Candomblé, French sociologist, Roger Bastide. When Bastide, that his work on Candomblé and the writing about it and the whole, his explorations of syncretism as a concept really situated Candomblé centrally within that, because what it showed was a certain ingenuity of enslaved Africans to begin to think anew of their traditions, and also a relative, I wouldn't necessarily call it an openness, but in not suppressing to the point where there was no room, right? That's the thing that we see as a very distinct.
But I think they were also able to tap into something that you mentioned earlier, which is the aesthetic part that the Catholics also had, and that now doesn't exist anymore. And that was used, for example, all the saints, the deities hidden behind the saints, and that allowed them to coexist. And that doesn't exist now. So there is no place where to hide, so to say, and protect yourself, right?
Right. There's no, exactly. And so not only just in terms of when we think about the tradition of processionals, when we think about the very strong history of confraternities that we see in spaces like with the Our Ladies of the Boya Morches, and other traditions that have this long legacy of processionals, where Catholic saints would be processed through a village, through a town, through the streets, and people recognizing when we go to the stairs on the 6th of January and Bonfim and wash the stairs when the Candomblé, it's recognizing that synergy of Jesus, of Christ, in this image of Oshala. And there isn't a conflict between how they are imagined in terms of the supremacy of the spirit, right? So that contracting element is what we could say and see as being the most damaging, because it doesn't allow, there's very little elasticity, very little space to explore, to be. And the attack that is happening, it brings me back to 1930s Haiti, during, or 1920s even, during the anti-superstitious campaigns where drums were burnt, where temples were ransacked, and sacred objects removed, right? And that is where, you know, those lines of defamation and desecration of sacred objects and implements cut to the core, because it leaves, and it only just cuts to the core, it creates fissures within the communities themselves, because the attacks are happening internally within families, you know, some who are Protestant, others who are not, and it's creating these deep wounds and cleavages within religious communities and within families. And you think, well, how can you build a nation with such divisiveness if you are trying to go towards a goal of unity, having a space where, you know, there can be room, inclusivity, and room for religious freedom is essential to any, not just democracy, but to any expression of humanity and what it means to live in the fullness of one's humanness. And so I want to open up to those.
And also cultural diversity, right?
Yes,
Because
of course. Yeah, and beyond cultural diversity, beyond the folkloric, because it's an interesting thing. There's a desire to rid a space like Salvador of its practitioners, of the spaces, of yet still there's a recognition of the incredible value, touristic value, that these traditions have. These are living religions that give meaning to the worlds of those who are practitioners, and they're at one breath being folklorized to fulfill, you know, the mandates of a tourism industry. These same traditions and practices, however, are being ostracized, blamed, accused of being also the filth of keeping Brazil's progress attenuated. So it's a really interesting conundrum that we find ourselves in terms of what these traditions mean beyond you know, a quaint folkloric relic, and a recognition that these are lived realities, lived experiences that have been part of these communities from time immemorial. Yeah.
Yeah, and also what is very scary is that, for example, Rio de Janeiro had a mayor that is a well-known evangelical priest, and imagine that he wanted to abolish Carnival, which is one of our biggest cultural expressions we have in Brazil. So it's really questioning the very basis of society, the very cultural, historical basis of society, and wanting to change that, right? So, which is really scary. Yes.
It's short-sighted, you know, and so the thing is, when faith begins to create a situation where your world becomes smaller, as opposed to being able to be a container of many, then you have to question, what is it? What are we losing in this exchange? Yeah. And because part of the beauty of Brazil is in its diversity, and its religious diversity is one of those things, whether it's Umbanda, whether it's Candomblé, whether it's the various practices associated with the caboclos, whether we're dealing with evangelicals, with Catholicism, that these are part of the rich cultural tapestry of the nation, right? That there are these various ways of which, and these traditions inform the music, it informs what is generated in the visual arts, it's informed how, you know, the various ways in which a jogador, when he hits a goal, how he represents that in his body and give reverence to something beyond himself. That these are all, these traditions, various religious traditions, leave their mark on not only the individual, but the collective, because it informs the ethos of the space. It is what makes a space, right? So in this sense of the rapid globalization and spread of the evangelical movement from across the continent, it's quite insidious because it's tapping into those very things that are part of the most intimate elements of people's lives. So the message is being broadcasted through indigenous musics, right? Sounds, it's using the very culture to spread the mission, right? But at the same time, being critical of that culture in the same breath. So it's an interesting way in which traditions are being used as a missionizing force, but at the same time, they're being critiqued and ousted as being backwards, right? And that is where part of the challenge and part of the paradox that we have to see ourselves through and try and make sense of as we think how to move forward. I'm not sure if there's any laws that have been passed, because I do believe in the Brazilian Constitution, there's freedom of religion, correct?
Yes, of course.
So how then is this, what allows for, if you will, these breaches in the contract, if you will?
It's a bit tricky. The Constitution says freedom of speech, freedom of worshipping, and they use exactly that as well. They say, so we are also free to spread our word, and we are free to gain new flocks of sheep. So they use the same law that allows and asks and begs for tolerance to exactly do that. And for example, some time ago, I was speaking to a friend, because as you know, I'm a linguist. The guy was talking about said, oh, you are a linguist, about beautiful work some people he know did in the Amazon region, where they studied the whole language of an Amerindian tribe, an unknown language, established a writing system. And I said, oh, beautiful thing. And he said, yeah, very beautiful, because we needed it in the church to be able to spread the word amongst them. So they studied the whole cultural system, the whole language, and use it as a tool to uproot the very souls of that incorporate that culture and that history and everything, right?
Yeah. And so therein, you know, and when you have people who are living on the fringes of security, you know, they're living precarious lives, either in violent situations, in vulnerable climate situations, vulnerable economic situations. There is when you come bearing a fruit that is seeming to be delectable, that's going to be your saving grace, there is a sense like, oh, let me hold on to that. And but that's part of the
it might be that biblical apple that you're biting in, right?
There you are. Exactly.
Okay, so let's see. Does anyone from the public have any questions to this beautiful presentation we are having tonight? Any comments? Yes, Len, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Good night. Good night, Marco. Good night, Dr. Hume.
Good night.
I have one question and then I have another suggestion there. Is there a concept of the devil in Candomblé? I always get confused about it. I know that some persons have a kind of made issue associated with the devil, but in the true essence of the religion, there's no description of that thing or that person that is the devil. Could you explain what your concept of that is, please?
Well, the concept of the devil is a Judeo-Christian concept, whether you want to call it devil or Satan. So that's where that resides. The notion of a devil figure doesn't exist in any African system of thought or derivative form that you would find in Africana traditions in the Americas, including the Black Atlantic, the Caribbean, spaces like Brazil. So within the kind of maligning of Candomblé practitioners and the tradition, what you found was initially Eshu, the god of the crossroads, the trickster divinity who's known to stand to represent fate and destiny. Eshu became imaged or imagined to be, quote unquote, the devil, but that has no bearing on the cosmological standing or orientation of the Yoruba tradition of which Candomblé derives. It's completely, that's completely outside of these traditions. It's completely outside of the theological matrix, the cosmovision, the cosmological matrix. There's no space for that. There's an understanding within within Yoruba philosophy of this notion of negative and positive forces. There's this of what would be called ire and asogbo, but these are not concepts that are lodged within this idea of angel and devil. That's not how they're understood at all. There is a deep understanding of the ways in which we come with our vices and our virtues, and part of our existence, part of our journey is to live in harmony and make sense of what those are and find what out and live as true as we can to our divine purpose. But the question of the devil is one that doesn't exist in terms of having space within Candomblé.
You answered my second question the way you put that on, because I wanted to ask, how is it that a religion that doesn't have a devil has been demonized? How can you demonize something that doesn't even have the devil as part of the whole concept of the religion?
I think part of sorry, go ahead.
Right, you did answer that for me. But the second part, when you spoke about the evangelical movement now, how it attempts to use the culture to destroy the very essence of African religion, I was going to propose to you before you said to that I think that the syncretism has happened within the evangelical movement without them even knowing that, because all of the music is African based, all those rhythms, and they play everything from salsa to calypso to reggae in terms of what they call gospel music. All of that has the African rhythms that belong to Orishas within that music. So subconscious, without them knowing, they have been syncretized, but they think that they are trying to take something away from someone else. But in their efforts to destroy the African religion, they themselves have become African religion, because in churches in Barbados, they sing choruses, and I don't know if you've ever heard choruses being sung, they go around and round and round, and it's very, very energetic, lots of movement, lots of dancing, lots of Africanness in that very church, evangelical church or Christian missions and so on. So they think that some of them have tried to destroy, they've swallowed it in totality, and they're just using English words, but everything else is African. I don't know how it is in Brazil, but probably everything is in Portuguese, but they're basically using everything African as the component of that evangelical movement.
Yes, it's what I was trying to hint at earlier is that what Marco did mention as well is while there has been a kind of a neutering of the aesthetic elements. So there's no imagery, right? So there's no iconography or image making or objects centered within the evangelical practices. What we do see is that the body, however, is centered. So those in the kind of, whether it's in the gesticulations of the pastor, the ways in which the pastor moves and with the congregation, the way the congregation stands and
call and response, all of that.
So there is a structure within the way that these Protestant type traditions are making their way across the globe and incorporating elements, performative elements of African traditions within them. That's very much a part of how, but it's not perceived as being African, right? One might say it's a way to make it less foreign, right? But it's interesting that we're finding people not making the connections, because in the same way, some of the reasons why Africana traditions are often demonized and seen as being a negative force is out of ignorance, right? First and foremost. And it comes out of a legacy of systematic racism. It comes out of a legacy of the ways in which you have this idea of barbarism and civilization, and how African customs and cultures have always been positioned along this continuum within the barbaric. So anything that is coming from these spaces we're not revered as holding anything of worth or value. And so their derivative forms that we find across the Americas fall within that, and we're positioned to be, positioning them as being antithetical to Christian traditions meant that you set up your other, right? You set up the negative that you're going to against, and it gives therefore a justification as to why you needed to win souls, right? Why you needed to convert. And it gives a justification for a whole slew of things, for colonization, imperialism, all of that. It fits within how religion operates as an incredible pillar within the structure of conquest. Yeah, I just have to plug in my computer. Just 1 second.
Okay. Actually,
but I'm
listening. Of that.
Yeah, but So listening, if there's another question, I'm just going to.
Just one last thing and I'll go.
I'm listening.
Right. Okay.
You can go ahead.
Back to in terms of the reference of Eshu as the devil. Now, Eshu is supposed to be God of the crossroad, or the God of the path, the God of the faith. Now, Jesus in the Bible says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Why, when they're constructing these opposites, why couldn't they have married those two and made a reference to him in terms of Jesus rather than a devil that is non-existent within the religion? That's my last piece. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. And I think, part of how the associative ways in which the Orishas get read in is visuality, right? So Eshu is often depicted with well, he's depicted in different ways depending on the tradition. In Lukumi, he's depicted with as a conical head with the cowrie shell eyes and nose and mouth. But within Candomblé, he was often depicted as a mound, like a mound with a kind a three, like a fork, right? And you know how this idea of the devil with the fork. So because the shrine spaces would have this three-pronged fork in a mound to represent Eshu's power, that becomes read as, oh, that's like the devil. His colors are red and black, so there's an association in which within their mind and worldview around what the devil looks like, this then becomes morphed. To say that Jesus is the path, that in itself is a rhetoric that doesn't have a visual form, right? And there isn't a cognate between how Jesus is imaged and what he's believed to appear as with what, for example, Eshu is deemed to look like. So that's part of how these kind of misinformed conflations happen.
Yeah. Yanique, they say that by 2030, evangelicals will be the majority in Brazil. We know today Catholics are the majority. 2030 is 8 years from here. So my question in Latin is, quo vadis? Where are you going, Brazil? What do you think?
That is a really sobering reality, that you share. And because I cannot say necessarily that the lives of Brazilians have demonstratively been improved through this move, or whether this move has afforded a certain level of stability and security and an ability to actually have a sense of being able to exist in the fullness of who you are. In fact, it has created a more divisive and fractious society. So the alarm is, because there is not only, it reminds me of the Crusades, because it's not only is it just spreading, but there is violence that is attached to it. And violence that takes the shape in terms of not only just the physical violence, but the structural violence. What is denied of a person? For example, I know Maide Santos and Felix Santos who at this stage do not wear their ritual implement, their ritual adornments, their eleques, their ideas in public, so that they're not necessarily identified, and therefore run the risk of not being able to secure a job. So when we think about the implications, it really has, it's worrisome, because it impacts the how people are able to stand in their truth and live authentically, but also how they're able to make an honest living and live an honest life, if in fact their very options for employment, for access to general access to the means of a better life are being reduced. And if the very sanctities of the spaces that they call their refuge are being attacked, it leaves very little room for for imagining another future. But we must stay the course, They say force, and being able to educate. And I think part of the situation is that a lot of the traditions in Africana religions have been, they've lived under the cloak of secrecy. and for a reason, for a time, but this secrecy in part has hurt the tradition in that it has created a certain ignorance to be fostered. And so for me, the one moves from a space of fear out of ignorance, and that ignorance is what is keeping an ability to see those synergies, or those that we could actually coexist, right? And that there is no need to live in this restrictive, constrictive way, that there is a space for various people to coexist and still operate at the maximum, at the maximum levels of their productivity. When you strip a collective of the very thing that gives them an identity and a meaning and a way that they shape and understand their world, you may be winning a few souls, but you're also leaving them vacant of so much more, and it's not enough to fill up the churches and say, oh, we have however many adherents, because it runs the risk, because there's a certain conservatism in the practice that moves individuals away from the very pulse of life, from the things that they create, the music they listen to. There's a certain denial of the things that will bring placer, a pleasure, right? There's a certain stripping away of those, the things that we call sweet in life. And I wonder, what's life without the sweetness of Oshun? If it's just, yeah. And if everyone is moving to the same drum that is not allowing them to, well, I can't say, because people, speaking about religion is a difficult thing, because people come to it with a certain conviction. And so I don't want to be disrespectful of those who feel convicted in there that this is what is for them. But I say, in the same way that you could have and live with this conviction that this is for you, that same respect needs to be afforded to those who say, but this path is for me.
Yeah. So definitely it's not just in religion, but tolerance is what we need most, to accept other people's way of life, way of thinking, philosophy.
Yeah.
And being intolerant is what is not really acceptable, because that only allows one way. And that's not what we are all about in this world, right?
Yeah. And it breeds greater, the level of hate that is then able to ensue doesn't just impact at the level of the churches. It spreads into these communities, it spreads across families, it spreads across neighborhoods, and that's where the damage gets done.
Physically and psychologically, I would say. So it's violence in those two senses. Yes. So, okay, do we have any other questions, any other observations from the public? Because it's already, 16 past the hour?
Yeah.
If not, Yanique, muito obrigado.
Ai, obrigado a você.
Prazer ter você aqui.
Prazer mesmo.
So it was very, very interesting. It made us think a lot, think about Brazil and our cultural aspects, about Afro-Brazilian religions, especially Candomblé. So it was a very beautiful session. And I thank you in the name of the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Community College for having time to be here with us.
And thank you for this wonderful invitation, for this moment to share. And I'm lighting my candles for Brazil, for the jogadores, and then we will see what happens. Oh, yeah.
Tomorrow, right? I'm wearing yellow casually today, so.
I'll bring out my yellow tomorrow. Yes.
Yes. Okay, so people, that's it from us here this week. Next week, we will be back with another topic. And thank you very much for being here. I say goodbye and boa noite.
Boa noite. Até logo.
Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Okay, ciao.